Hi, it's Les Reid again. We're here down in the Newark Heritage Museum Barge Leicester Trader, and we're going through a number of photographs, what's generally known as between bridges. So that's it in the River Hull, at Hull, and it's between Drypool Bridge and North Bridge. And it was always a hive of activity, like these photographs, at first of flood, tide time. And the bridgemen who came on at 4 hours, these would all be jockeying for position to get through the bridges as soon as they possibly could. So the interesting things in this one, so right at the front, we've got one of Furley's, Rickall. He'll be probably going to King George Dock to load grain, probably for Gainsborough. Now behind him, we've got the clay sloop, former clay sloop, Miss Madeline, and his lighter. Well, they were working for Earl's Cement, and they've unloaded clay from Barton Clay Pits, and they had 2 sloops, which were motorised, and 2 lighters at this time. So these 2 empty ones would be going downriver to go across to get into Foster's Creek at Barton, and they would pass somewhere in the river coming the other way, the other ship, Miss Patricia, and his lighter coming loaded to get themselves up harbour on the same tide. But then all the other boats that are on the move. So behind them is Michael, which I think might have been an ex-Harker's Sheffield boat. But over here, you've got Greendale, which was the main towing barge for Trent Carriers Limited, who used to tow this barge. And then beyond him, at the back, I'm fairly certain that's Brunton that used to run to York, because you've got very shallow bulwarks. So, and I know that this ship here, with the wooden aft deck cabin and that wheelhouse, that's Lincoln and Hull's Graveller. And then, which was a World War I AS steam barge. And then this is Ichabod, another AS barge, which was at that time owned by Dave Cooks. And then behind him, you've got Trafford with that wheelhouse and cabin, which was another AS barge. So there's a real jumble of motor barges, Ranks' lighters over there. There's all sorts. There are so many different categories of barge that there's no one black and white answer to anything. Everything's in the grey. So here we've got another one, more or less from the same position. The photographer's vantage point has been Drypool Bridge. And this is a little bit earlier, but it's almost the same mix of boats doing exactly the same thing. It was almost like every tide time, shuffle in the pack and coming to a different conclusion. So we've got fairly certain these Lincoln and Hull barges, fairly certain that's their Lincoln size former keel Tim Tom. So this is another AS steam barge, the Cosmos. That's Graveller again. And then you've got an AC, which was another type of First World War barge. These were World War I barges, were designed and built to a size that would go across the channel and take supplies into the French canals. So they were all designed of a size that would fill the locks in France and Belgium. But then, so also we've got Queen's View there, and then we've got Brayford, the other one of Lincoln and Hull's Lincoln size keels. This one here, I think, is Luminary, which was owned by Dave Cooks at that time, and his lighter, which is either Polar or Vega, which they put an engine in afterwards. So these would have brought gravel from Besthorpe Wharf up the Trent. these would have brought gravel from Girton up the Trent, which was Lincoln and Hull's own pit. And here again, we've got the other clay ship and his lighter waiting to go and do the changeover with the one we saw in the previous picture. So yet again, another bundle of ships coming, going, and because Lincoln Halls had only got 3 berths, they've got 2 berths on high flags. So you get this one and that one on high flags, and possibly Graveler on Lime Street. And then the smaller boat was likely to be an on and off boat. So there'd be 2 boats go up with the tide, get on there, get unloaded, come away, come back down to between bridges to lay up for the next tide. He would go on and be unloaded to come off as well. And then the next ones would go on and stay on over the next tide to float off at the next daytime high water. So yet again, another bundle of different ships, which would change every tide or every daytime tide, making it interest for the boat spotter. So here we're still between bridges, but this is much later, I think. And looking at which barges there are, I personally think we're into the 80s here, because this one here is the gravel barge Besthorpe, which in these colours was owned by John Dean, and behind him is the barge that was built for Hodgson's of Beverley called George Odey, and in the 80s I'm fairly certain that was owned by John Dean then, and running gravel from Besthorpe to Up Harbour. So what we've got on the wall side here, we've got the wreck lifting vessel BB, and I think that's Dave Cook's dredger Burkham Sand, or one of the former Docksboard dredgers anyway, most likely Burkham. Now this one here, bit of a checkered career. This was one of the Harker's L prefixed series of Leeds running black oilers. And there was Lingdale, Langdale, Loondale and Littendale. And 3 of those got scrapped. And this one, for some reason, got saved. And Harker sold it to Corey's. So it then came out as a black oiler in Corey's colours. And that's how it didn't get scrapped by Harker's. And then Les Taylor bought it, and his brother, and converted it into a graveler. And this was the last boat on the river to have an old style Blackstone EPV engine, 120 horsepower, 3 cylinders. And the design of them, the aft end was all high because in the middle they had a huge vertical boiler, an old style boiler, oil fired though, which came right to the top of the casing behind the wheelhouse. And then they had a galley down one side and a sleeping accommodation bit on the other side. And that lived on well into the 80s, doing gravel and all sorts of other jobs, but that's gone for scrap now. This is one of Whitaker's. It looks like Wheatcroft to me, and he's going up end on. So he's probably going to stay that way round. So he's going to pump off over the top of the tide. And then by the time the tide is running out, he can then drop down, back down, and get himself back onto Whitaker's berth for the next tide. And this is Lincoln and Hull's Marnham, one of the bigger ones, 500 tonner. And he's obviously come off of high flags, and he's going to sail to Girton on that tide. But because he's a bit late on the tide, they do end up catching up with the early boats, because the later boats have got a better water, so sometimes they can take shortcuts and they can get a better run of tide, whereas the early ones are struggling over the bottom at the top end. And very often these later sailing boats catch up with the earlier ones anyway. But but there's a lot less boats there. So all the coal boats had finished by this time, I think, and a lot of the little boats. There's not one former keel or sloop here, you see. Only the big boats left by this time. So that was the progression, and whether it was a good progression or not, I don't know, but it was almost the beginning of the end. So this one, not so many boats in the picture, but it's we're looking at the new Drypool Bridge, which was the vantage point for some of the other photographs we've just been looking at. And so in the foreground, it's a right misty, cold, damp winter morning. I can feel it. And the photographer here is more or less standing on the gates of Central Dry Dock. And these are Ranks's lighters. And this is the former brick sloop Swinefleet, which was owned by a company that used to work the brickyard up Market Wheaton Canal, up Wheaton River. And it eventually belonged to Flixborough Shippings, and then I think by this time it belonged to Don Ashton at Carlton-on-Trent. So he's probably got gravel in from Besthorpe as well. And then behind him is Lincoln and Hull's Lincoln former keel Brayford. But it's just another view looking the other way from the first photographs. And this is just a picture of Drypool Bridge, what not to do when you're guessing that you can get under the bridge and you can't, not quite. And I'm not sure whether he's going to be stuck for the tide or whether or not he's just stuck a little bit and only part of the boat won't go under. But sometimes you could get him to go if you got the bow of the boat between the bridge girders, and sometimes you'd be bouncing off the rivets. So all good fun up harbour. So to add to the photographs we just looked at, in the time as a lad, I used to haunt Lincoln and Hull's barges, and this is one of mine. I bought a Kodak Brownie 44A camera that I know cost 22 shillings and sixpence, and you used to get 12 prints out of it, and I used to get a film from Woolworths for 2 bob, and then my mate in the chemistry class used to run the prints off for 3pence each. But here we are at Girton Pit, where all those barges of Lincoln and Hull's that we've seen between bridges, this is where they're loading. And I've taken this photograph out of Graveller's wheelhouse. So, and on the back end, that's my old mentor, Alec Carrigan, Billy Taylor, the skipper. So this is Graveller. That's Queen's View we were talking about. So that's Sam Whitaker, skipper of Queen's View, and his brother-in-law. That's Jim Ryan, skipper of this one, AC Barge AC20. And here we are on the low jetty at Girton, where they would load part sand and part gravel, but this was always for High Flags Wharf. And we've got some interesting information because I've got some of the daybooks from the pit when these were loaded. So that was what I used to do when I was still at school. And I'd never be allowed to do it again these days, and kids today would never get the opportunity. It's a shame. So here's just one more. This is not between bridges, although it's between North Bridge and Scott Street Bridge. And this is one that I took of Graveller, a boat you might as well say I was in love with at the time anyway. And I wanted to get a picture of the propeller because everything bared out over the tide to float the next tide. And this is Lincoln Hull's Lime Street Wharf, where what was called All-Ups always went. And the top jetty at Girton was always All-Ups, and that I didn't find out until Fred Schofield told me it was a corruption of the word given to when the gravel was hauled up from the bottom of the riverbed by sailing barges with their own, by hand wound on the four roller with their own mast and derricks. with a contraption that used to be dragged along the riverbed and then lifted and tipped into the hold. So that was the all-ups was the corruption of hauled up. And it was all because they had a screening plant and did ready-mix concrete on Lime Street. That was what was always unloaded there, and we'll show you that in the day book. So this book is like a piece of gold to me, and this was rescued from a dustbin by a friend of mine who worked at Girton Pit, and this is the day book. So everything that happened in the pit went into here. And so we're looking at between the 15th of March to the 14th of June 1964. And I've picked this day, Wednesday the 25th, because there was a good number of ships. And also, so there's Graveler there, which was my old mate, and Chaz, which was Tony was mate on. So and this shows, we've got here where they'd loaded for, the name of the barge, what it got in, and how much, and its draft, and its tonnage. So then that's all added up into a daily tonnage for barges, which then had additionally different lorries loaded. So you'd got 1,642 tons went away by barge that day, with a total, including lorries, of 1,717 tons out of Girton Gravel Pit. And of these barges, so LS Lime Street, with the all-ups, what I've just said about for the ready-mix plant. So Cosmos, that was a former AS World War I barge, and he's got 164.5 tons in, loaded to 6'9". At that time they were running to Castleford, taking gravel there. They'd done Castleford and Ferrybridge to build the new power station towers there. So Hilderthorpe's loaded to 6'11.5" with cementing sand, 166.5 tons. He's 6'11.5". Graveler, HF high flags. So he's got 1.5 inches, 70 tons, and 3/4, which was grades of gravel, 91.5 tons at 6'9", a total of 161.5 tons. And by this time, Hoveringham Gravels had taken over, and they were a lot more precise with their tonnages than the guesswork from when Lincoln and Hulls were just taking their own stuff for their own account. So then Laundries, that was short for Cité de Laundries, which still had its French name on, World War I. Chaz for Lime Street, more all-ups. Tower Street 1171, so we know that was by the time of Hoveringham, because that was their wharf by that time, and he's got 3/4 and sand. The AC barges always carried a lot better than the AS barges. And AC20 for high flags. Ichabod, which was Dave Cook's AS barge. Coarse sand for Tower Street. And a barge called Sand with 212 tons at 3/4. So, and some of these drafts were at 6'9", that first boat would get away at 6'9" and get further down the river. As the tide came, they might load them a bit deeper, knowing that those boats weren't going to get all the way down. There were different reasons why they loaded them to different drafts. But this is an absolute eye-opener into one day mayhem at Girton Pit.